But yes, we are utterly delighted that Edna Suárez-Díaz was able to make a stop in Exeter this September and also give the seminar for us. This is really wonderful because Edna not only is based at UNAM and has, of course, full professors with many, many years and really main person kind of driving history of philosophy of science there, but also, she's incredibly accomplished and incredibly busy as a researcher. She's involved in many, many projects at the moment. Many projects at the moment, and she's constantly traveling the world, also part of some of these projects. So we are utterly lucky and delighted that she was able to stop here today. So Edna is, for many of us, our friends since many, many years. Certainly I've been benefiting from her mentorship and inspiration from her work since I was a first-year PhD student, when I was first invited to UNAM, and I had one of the times of my life. I guess that's why I'm standing here now, because I just loved it so much. I thought actually being an academic is pretty good after all. And now she is kind of involved in the directorship also of the center that is based at the UNAM, which is a very, very important center, one of the most important centers in Latin America for history and philosophy of science. And work has long been straddling many of the strands of work that interest of us as a core and central subject here in Venice. She's worked on the modernization of evolutionary biology. She's worked on questions around human variation, the history of thinking about human variation. She's also worked on the computation in the life sciences, on a very broad spectrum of interpretations around what computation may mean. And this was well before the whole fashion around big data, et cetera, came in. And she's done a lot of work which is historical, mostly focusing on the 20th century, but also focusing on a lot of the conceptual implications of this work. So really, while I would say probably the main home is still the history of science, she's really well known as an HPS person all around. She's had lots of interactions also with social scientists, and she's had lots of collaborations with scientists. In fact, she also sits in the biology faculty of the UNAM. Since 10 years, she's in charge of revising their syllabus, which I'm told is not quite finished as a job, but just to give you a sense of all the different ways in which Edna's work really, again, kind of is very, very close to the kind of approach that we are also pushing here. I'm not going to go on and describe all the different topics and different things that Edna's been involved in. One of the things that's very central to her work at the moment is this question around circulating knowledge and what does it mean to connect different parts of the world that have been producing knowledge, particularly biomedical knowledge, biological knowledge, through different organizations, which may not be just professionals, so also kind of state organizations, also different kinds of agencies, etc., etc. She does this in collaboration with many different people around the world, but now I think her work really is entering a kind of global history phase, where she's doing this at the level of global networks more and more. So we are really looking forward to your talk. Thank you very much again, Edna, for being here.
Thank you, Sabina, for the very warm welcome, and I want to thank you and John. I know since so many years ago. I'm so happy to be here. Well, the last time I was here in January 2018, I talked about objectivity and the reconstruction of life's past. As different as the subject may seem to you, to the title of my talk today, historically, the study of biological evolution at the molecular level is closely connected with the study of disease at the molecular level. Linus Pauling, who in 1949 coined the term molecular disease, said that at the molecular level, disease and evolution are both two sides of the same coin. As reductionists and naive that this definition may seem today, the two areas are intimately connected and can only be properly understood as part of the larger history of biomedicine and biomedical research in the post-war period. So I guess it's not that strange that I have been working on these two subjects for a long time. So in the last few years, I've been leaning more towards the history of biomedical research. Today, I'm going to talk about my new project on the globalization of biomedicine and biomedical research. This project is part of a larger collaborative research award, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust and is grounded here at the University of Exeter. It is coordinated by Dora Darga, who is faculty member of this university, by Sarah Max from Birkett College in London, and myself, Sebastián Fonseca, who is postdoc in this project is here, and so maybe some of the other postdocs and participants of this project might be connected via Zoom. This project is very ambitious since it basically aims to rewrite the history of global health and medicine from the perspective of socialism. The project then has these different goals. The first goal is to try to understand how socialism shaped the practices and cultures of medicine and global health. But of course, the question arises of what is socialism? Because I mean, so we really have to give a historical answer to what is socialism. Because if we restrain to state socialism, then we will have like a very constraining definition of what socialism is. So in a way, our project is also trying to answer the question of what is socialism by analyzing and understanding the practices of medicine and public health and how these practices have shaped the real existing socialism. Yeah? So in a way, you cannot use socialism as a framework to explain what happened inside these societies because we don't have like a single definition of what is socialism. Our project then devotes a lot of attention to Eastern Europe, not so much to China and the Soviet Union, to all the new nations created after decolonization in Africa and Asia, and to internationalist interventions from China, Cuba, and the European socialist countries. That is, this is a project that focuses on what was during the Cold War period known as the Second and the Third Worlds. Also, the project is very much focused on networks of socialist solidarity, that is, socialist networks practitioners in Latin America, Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia, more than on national histories of medicine. Luckily for us, there is a growing literature on this subject in recent years, which has helped us to step up to advance our goals in this project. So as you can probably imagine, in many senses, the broad scope of this project is terra incognita. As a historian of the life sciences with an interest in the nuclear sciences and technologies in Latin America, I had already done some historical research on developmentalist projects from the 1950s to the 1980s in the Third World. But this project has certainly taken me out of my previous fields, and it has required me to do archival research in several places. I'm very excited, for instance, that this week I will be doing archival research at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and at the National Archives in London. And then this is a stop before a larger event in South Africa, where members of our project are going to interview more than 20 African health officials and medical researchers, many of whom were trained in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Others also were trained in Western Europe, and all of whom play a crucial role in the enactment of health institutions in their newly created nations. So just to give you an example of all the things that I've been doing in the last year, especially when archives started to be open, in order to have the materials for such an ambitious project. So, to share with you more concrete questions and findings that I have at this stage of my individual project within this larger project, I will start with this quote by historian of medicine, Roberta Vivens. And this photograph of a technician in Iraq measuring radioactive iodine uptake in the early 1960s, very probably to diagnose thyroid function. As Vivens claimed more than a decade ago, when talking about post-colonial medicine, scholars have uncovered fluid and multilateral networks of exchange and have crafted histories of medical knowledge and practices as simultaneously international and idiosyncratically local. I take this reference, I find it very fruitful, and I take it as a guideline. The study of global medicine in the second half of the 20th century has revealed a broad range of transnational actors and international networks, and the history of socialist networks created in the name of people's solidarity in the decades after World War II is not different in that sense. But the challenge for historians is how to provide at the same time a sense of what it is idiosyncratically local. How can we do that? How can we ground these ambitious global histories into the local histories that provide the texture of stories that historians appreciate. My answer has been to take inspiration from this Iraqi technician, who happens to be a woman, who is using radioisotope tracing to study the physiology of the patient, much in the same way today than a PET study uses radioactive labeled glucose to trace the metabolism of cancer cells. So my approach will be to use a few biomedical technologies which were relatively common in laboratories all around the world between the early 1960s and the 1980s to trace the history of these global networks. These technologies include radioisotope tracing, electrophoresis, and immunoassays. I need to confess, though, that this is not a very original strategy. Other historians of science, for instance, Angela Krieger and Simone Turchetti, have used this idea and have followed radioisotopes as tracers of history, which reveal economic, political, and geopolitical processes. The difference here with my project is that instead of one, I will be using 2 or 3 biomedical technologies. I have not decided if I will include immunoassays, which were used in complementary ways to study a few selected diseases, which were commonly found in third world countries during the so-called decades of development, which are the decades between the 50s and the early 70s. So now, what do these technologies, radioisotope tracing, electrophoresis, and immunoassays have in common? I would say they are all relatively mundane technologies, or at least mundane by the standards of scientific experimentation in the biomedical sciences, by which I mean that by the mid-1960s, they were already available as commodities that you could purchase, and they were relatively cheap. They were also easily transportable. That it means that they were not very large, but small and light. They did not require large infrastructures to be operational, and people were easily training them in many laboratories and universities around the world. Even if they were relatively expensive for a lot of research laboratories in post-colonial Africa or Latin America, they were not unavailable on the scale that a nuclear reactor or a thermoelectric plant would be in the 1960s. These relatively mundane technologies were often used together in biochemistry and biomedical research and provided the technological context of basic research in the life sciences during those decades. Thus, by the mid-1960s, the mobilization of these technologies and their use around the globe had made them relatively inexpensive, and thousands of medical researchers have already learned how to use them and apply in a variety of research contexts. So take, for instance, radioisotopes, which I already mentioned. This is the one truck of the mobile radioisotope exhibition that traveled through Latin American countries between 1960 and 1965. There were 2 different trucks, one that traveled in Asia and Africa during those same years. And this one was the one who traveled from Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the United States through Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and then ended up in Puerto Rico. But it's very interesting because only in Mexico, for instance, it trained more than 1,000 technicians, medical doctors, etc. Even though there was already some training of local scientists in radioisotopes before this mobile exhibition, it really increased the number of people who were trained in these technologies. So this is, I have been writing on this kind of mobilization, material mobilization of knowledge in some articles with my colleague Gisela Mateos. And the story of this truck is really fascinating because the hero of the story is the driver. It's not a scientist, it's the driver who really manages to take the truck along all these roads in rural Latin America. So it's really a very nice story. Okay, so very soon after the announcement of the Atoms for Peace initiative in 1953, Thousands of experts were trained in the biological applications of radioisotopes in many different countries, in regions all over the world. Many Latin American countries, like Brazil and Argentina, had scientific establishments in the nuclear sciences already in the 1940s. Mexico, for instance, was already manufacturing radioactive labeled molecules for biomedical research already in the late 1960s. Also, after decolonization, several African countries like Ghana and Nigeria, and many Asian and Middle East countries, including the Philippines, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, India, and Israel, among many others, had created atomic establishments, and radiobiologists started to use radioisotopes not only for diagnosis and therapeutic uses, but also as tools in biomedical research. Okay. Now, think of electrophoresis, a technique that allows the separation of biological molecules, notably proteins, according to its electric charge and its molecular weight, which make it an ideal tool to uncover genetic variation at the molecular level. By the beginning of the 1960s, a few American and European companies, which continue to exist nowadays, had standardized not only the apparatus, and these are some pictures, but I'm going to tell you more about these photographs, not only the apparatus and other peripheric instruments of electrophoresis, but also the reagents and chemical components needed to make them work. One of those companies whose instruments you could find either in Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, Mexico, Ghana, or Nigeria is Biorad, an American company owned by a family. It still even today, and it was one of the first companies that standardized electrophoresis apparatus and all the components that come with it, and then made these very cheap transportable models. This is a model, the model where I learned to do electrophoresis in the 80s. This is a more recent model of the 1990s. You can find them everywhere, even the Soviet Union, which is also very interesting, and Czechoslovakia. And this is the electrophoresis apparatus by Biorad at my brother's laboratory. He's a molecular biologist, and of course he got his own Biorad electrophoresis apparatus. Okay, so yeah, okay. So electrophoresis was used in many research contexts, but most importantly in the detection of, sorry, I forgot to tell you that I just made some research at the WHO archives, which were opened finally after the pandemics. And I could find since the late and middle 1960s, 70s, and 80s, that laboratories in Nigeria, in Ghana, were asking some materials and instruments with projects with money from the WHO. And in the list of the things that they were requiring, it was this kind of apparatus, the Biorad electrophoresis, because it's so easy, it's cheap, you can put it like anywhere. So it's really interesting, and it's one of the things that I would love to do, is to do archival work in the company, because I think that would be very productive for me. Okay, so electrophoresis was used in many research contexts, but most importantly in the detection, as I told you, of genetic variation. As I mentioned also, it was Linus Pauling who famously used electrophoresis to show that sickle cell anemia, a blood disease commonly found in African American and African populations, was related to a genetic anomaly in the hemoglobin molecule of patients. So of course, Pauling used an insanely huge and expensive electrophoresis apparatus in the late 1940s that only he and another scientists in Uppsala were able to buy and to use. So it's just amazing how in 15 years or less, electrophoresis became so cheap, and so of course so movable around the world. After that, electrophoresis was used to survey genetic variation related to blood diseases in populations around the world, including indigenous populations. Several of these genetic variations were distributed along with malaria. And so a lot of research done on the epidemiology of malaria also supported the biomedical research on genetic anomalies in proteins of the blood, most of them related to different types of anemias. This is Ruben Misker, a medical geneticist, whom I have published some papers about his work. He worked a lot with indigenous populations in Mexico, and so he was the first one who really contributed to all this knowledge of genetic variation in Mexico. Okay, so these studies by Misker and many others were supported with the funds and infrastructure of the malaria eradication campaigns, because many of these genetic mutations, were strictly correlated with distribution of malaria, and they were part of the pharmacogenetics research done at the time. So it is very interesting to see how all these biomedical researchers actually were working on top of all these public health campaigns. From these examples, I want to draw your attention to two characteristics of this type of research. One is the fact that in Latin America, East Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and in the transnational networks that connected these regions, biomedical research, for instance, medical genetics, took place in close contact with large public health campaigns, like the malaria eradication campaigns, oftentimes sharing the same resources or using the infrastructure of those large campaigns to do the fieldwork and laboratory research required for biomedicine. This is very important, especially for historians of medicine, who tend to separate the history of public health from the history of biomedicine. So we can see here that the two things are together. A second feature is that the diseases which were chosen for biomedical research in this context were idiosyncratically local. Indeed, anemias and related forms of malnutrition were subjects of intense research in the Third World and Southern Europe. Often, they were tackled in projects associated with socialist technical assistance from Eastern Europe, where malnutrition and anemias were also a problem, at least in some countries, and supported by the WHO as part of large public health campaigns. Now, the subject of anemias is too ambitious from the point of view of historians of medicine and nutrition science. There are, after all, more than 400 types of anemias, some of them structural, like sickle cell anemia and thalassemias, and many others associated with nutrition deficiencies, hemolysis, and other conditions, including leukemias. Malnutrition also, on the other hand, has been the subject of agricultural and economic historians, not just of historians of medicine and public health. And there is a gigantic literature on the subject, so you can imagine that this is a huge topic in the study of malnutrition. Since the late 1930s, however, scientists, officials, and clinicians succeeded in framing malnutrition and anemias narrowly as diseases of the blood, which is the kind of approach that I'm going to take in order to narrow and to ground this point. Okay, so once you choose to characterize anemias as diseases of the blood, one of the most intriguing types of anemia was the kwashiorkor type. So, in case you are not familiar with this term, kwashiorkor is a very recognizable type of extreme malnutrition caused by the lack of protein and characterized by these large protruding bellies. So I'm sure you have seen these pictures of children who are really very thin, but with a large protruding belly, and they have a lot of horrible, terrible symptoms like fatigue, loss of muscle, failure, and most importantly, failure to gain weight and recover even when enough food is provided. So it was a very kind of intriguing disease. Why you don't get better even if you get the nutrients and food that you need. So that was a big problem for people working on nutrition science at the time. So it's interesting that from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, particularly in the context of the starvation of Biafra citizens and children provoked by the Nigerian Civil War, Kwashiorkor concentrated the attention of international, national, private relief, and technical assistance agencies. So you can see, I mean, there is a really, it becomes like a very hot topic in many places of the world, the story, the biochemical understanding of Kwashiorkor in those years. There were different hypotheses as to why children or people affected by this extreme form of malnutrition could not be cured simply by ingesting food. This became a very intriguing and relevant subject of research because international agencies and national health institutions assumed that understanding the mechanisms causing the metabolic disequilibrium were very relevant to provide a solution where they could make the best uses of the scarce resources in context of poverty. So this kind of research was intimately connected with other types of research. For instance, there was a lot of research in those years in nutritional science on the different sources of protein, for instance, the quality of protein coming from plants, plant proteins or animal proteins. So there is a lot of research on that because they really want to understand what is the different metabolic pathways in the absorption of nutrients. So this becomes a very important subject in many, many places, even in the first world. So, so of course, this was a very hot topic, and in December of 1960, the World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency organized the first joint conference on tropical medicine in Bangkok, Thailand. Resulting from that meeting, the International Atomic Energy Agency agreed to enlarge its sponsorship of research contracts on this topic. And a small gathering to plan the new directives was organized by the medical section of the Radioisotopes division in Vienna. This meeting happened in 1962 with the assistance of experts from many different places, the UK, for instance, Jamaica, Argentina, Puerto Rico, India. Not surprisingly, after the meeting, the severe malnutrition of infants in tropical and subtropical regions was classified as a research priority by the International Atomic Energy Agency, that for other topics. But of course, they did a lot of research with the WHO and with other agencies like the FAO, for instance. Radioisotope applications could be developed to provide precise diagnosis and were employed in research on the metabolism of proteins. Researchers had shown in 1961 that radioisotopes could be used to trace the absorption of elements and nutrients into metabolism. This was a subject where experts from developing countries could have a very relevant participation. So in the early years of this collaboration between these two United Nations agencies, there was a 1,000 growth rate in the United Nations budget, destined only to the biochemistry of malnutrition and protein metabolism. The metabolism of Kwashiorkor, for instance, was a subject of research at the Ghana National Institute of Health and Medical Research, the country where Kwashiorkor had first been categorized as a medical condition. Also in Accra, a radioisotope technique had already been used to investigate electrolyte movements in diarrheal disease in infants at the Princess Mary Louise Hospital. The United Nations World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency collaborated in this topic, and a lot of biomedical research already happened in Latin America, Eastern Europe, East Asia, and African laboratories. Okay, so just to give you an example of the kind of projects that were being doing in those years in this collaborative project. Experts from the so-called Second World, namely the East European countries, actively promoted technical collaboration in the name of socialist solidarity beyond the isolationism of the Soviet Union and China during the early decades after World War II. So it's really nice to see all these letters in the archives where you find, how scientists all over the world were collaborating. So here we have some letters from researchers from Ghana, Mexico, and the Philippines who participated into these United Nations funds. Okay, so I would like to come to some preliminary conclusions, and I will be later on very happy to receive your feedback and your questions. But what can I say at this very early stage in my project on the globalization of biomedicine after World War II? As I mentioned, biomedical research, for instance, medical genetics, plays in close contact with large public health campaigns. Biomedical research in much of the third world takes place in close interaction with public health, oftentimes sharing the same resources and the same infrastructure. Also, the realm of malnutrition and anemias, as well as the immunology of tropical contagious diseases, is what I'm taking to be the idiosyncratically local in my global story or history of biomedicine in the third world. The other thing, which of course is very important for my project, is to look at the networks of collaboration, which included experts from regions all over the world, from local clinics and university laboratories, and many of these experts moved from those locations to temporary posts and to research facilities and international agencies. This context provided research opportunities where the first, the second, and the third world scientists could participate in the construction of knowledge. And of course, all these histories have made visible hundreds, if not even thousands, of relevant scientists and experts who so far have been invisible in the history of science and biomedicine. Well, now, I don't want to give like a very nice story only, and not everything was nice, of course. So this was not an easy road, and this is not only a history of networks and collaboration, but also of conflicts. Historians of African public health have shown that until the late 1960s, the British, Belgian, French, and Portuguese empires strategized to limit unwelcome WHO interventionism on their territories, thus constraining the capacity of multilateral campaigns and research programs. Training became the colonial powers' preferred form of intervention in health matters. Also in Africa, the interests of the remaining colonial powers acted against explicitly against regional collaboration between the African territories and the newly created nations. Nevertheless, there is much to learn in the history of how biomedical practices transform research and interventions in the complex global health challenge of malnutrition and anemias. After the war, science and technology were particularly appealing to newly decolonized nations, some of which embraced versions of high modernism to advance their country's social and economic goals. Science, technology, and development were also at the forefront of the so-called Second World's version of an alternative modernity to that of the Americans. International agencies such as the WHO and the IAEA acted as passage points of multilateral networks of experts, with their research laboratories acting as referees in the global evaluation of practices and materials. In the 1960s, the socialist governments of Iraq, Cuba, Bolivia, Ghana, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Congo, some of these countries were intermittently socialist and not socialist, so it's one of the difficulties of trying to define what is socialist in this context. Align their research agendas to incorporate biomedical practices and instruments into public health, in similar ways in which the governments of Mexico, Argentina, the Netherlands, South Africa, Israel, the United States, or Britain, which were not socialist, incorporated them as part of their health research agendas. These techniques were both contested, appropriated, and instrumentalized by local doctors and scientists who saw in them a path to a more rational use of human and economic resources in the fight for poverty. an interconnected endeavor without which it is not possible to account for the dominance of biomedical or biomedicine in health interventions. And as part of the historical project, to understand claims of universality of science and technology. The study of how sophisticated laboratory techniques such as electrophoresis and radioisotope tracing became part of the repertoire of tropical medicine in the so-called first, second, and third worlds requires to be written, however, from the perspective of the idiosyncratic local. Most of the newly decolonized African countries adopted socialism after independence and placed a great role in scientific progress as a requirement for economic and social development. I mention this just to give you an idea of the potential for collaboration among third world countries during those years, either directly in the name of anti-imperialism and solidarity, or through the multilateral agencies of the United Nations. As researchers in newly created national institutions or as officials at the international agencies, scientists from the third world built and sustained networks that took over a host of neglected diseases, most of them still classified under the colonial label of tropical medicine. So finally, I hope I have convinced you that radioisotopes, electrophoresis, and maybe immunoassays, as well as other modern technologies of the 1950s and to the 1970s could be used as historical tracers of biomedical research, revealing the crossing political and ideological frontiers during the early Cold War. Thank you.